welcome to today's HR Cubed webinar. My name is Mandy Chapman and I am the General Manager of HR Cubed. I'm delighted that today's webinar is brought to you in association with Oracle, whose HCM Cloud is helping companies of all sizes starting from just 500 employees to transform for the future. Oracle's HCM customers benefit from an intelligent, personal, adaptable and complete solution that helps their workforces to thrive. Before we get started, I do have a very quick overview of HCM Cloud. It's just 1 minute and 20 seconds. So while you settle in, please enjoy this small snippet and we'll be right back with the webinar.
Imagine a world where everything is intelligent. A workplace where complexities are simplified. What if you could create tomorrow, today? Imagine augmenting human capabilities with powerful intelligence, so systems know what you need, when you need it, on any device. Personalized so you can take action quickly. Imagine using AI to source the best fit candidates. Instead of candidates finding jobs, imagine jobs finding candidates. And they can access details via chatbots. New hires can complete onboarding activities in an easy and smart way even before they start their new job and be productive on day one. Achieve more than you thought humanly possible when human capabilities are augmented with AI. Oracle HCM Cloud. Simply powerful.
Before we get started, a few bits of housekeeping. If you have any problems at all, please use the chat panel and someone will help you. We have a couple of organisers on the line this afternoon. The webinar is being recorded so that it can be shared around, and there'll also be a white paper sent out to attendees with a detailed view of the webinar messages. So please sit back and relax, no need to take lots of notes. I'm delighted to say that I'm joined today by John Hunter, who's our Head of Change. John has over 30 years experience in HR and consulting. He spent the last 20 years with global technology service providers and large consulting organisations. John has also set up and led change consulting practices at HP and KPMG. John's experience spans large global and national companies across almost every sector. It's probably safe to say that John has seen the good, the bad and the ugly in change practice, and I'm really delighted that he's joining us today to help really demystify some of the areas that certainly stumped me, and I know many others, when grappling with the reasons that lots of change projects fail. And we've seen them fail due to not having the clear answers to the 6 big questions. So in terms of how the session will work, John will present the big 6 over the next 30 minutes. These are the key questions that your organisation should ask itself to really understand whether your change programme is setting itself up to succeed or to fail. And on the screen now are the themes that are being tackled with every question. We will stick to 1 hour and there will be plenty of time to tackle your questions. And we do welcome any and every question today, so please, nothing is off limits. I would say that we have quite a large audience with us, so firstly, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us this afternoon. Due to the number of attendees, we may not get to all of your questions, but please feel free to submit these on the chat panel, and we will respond to every question either live this afternoon or certainly by email afterwards. So this webinar is part of our philosophy at HR Cubed of giving practical support really to organisations who are going through some kind of change. The real reason that we're running it today is that we've seen over the years the number of programmes that have failed to deliver the objectives or the outcomes that they require. People tend to think of change as being a bit of a dark art and prone to failure. And we also see these failures in the most unlikely of places. And a high-profile example was a large central government organisation not in the UK, but who used a very well-established large consulting firm. This organisation that they used is well recognised as having one of the best change methodologies on the market. This programme, however, failed dramatically, and not due to quality of methodology. What this showed was that simply by having one of the best methodologies on the market, this does not in itself guarantee success. And what John is going to example for us today are the 6 key questions that every project or programme should ask to really ensure that they are well positioned to deliver successfully. I do need to warn you that what we have done is to pose some really challenging questions that people often ignore, sometimes deliberately, and that are actually very difficult to answer. But this is really the key to successful change. So although some of these questions, they may seem quite direct, there is a skill to positioning the question, to knowing your audience, and then also to following up. As well as the questions, what John will also do is pose some possible follow-up questions, and he'll also give you a number of really great takeaways. So please enjoy the webinar. I will say post your questions on the chat panel as we go. And without further ado, I will hand you over to John.
Thank you, Mandy, for the introduction, and welcome everybody. Today is about sharing our approach for understanding client organisations and their readiness to actively manage transformations, plus their available skills and experience. I should say up front that this is not a methodology or a framework or a toolkit or a one-size-fits-all panacea. So we find it practical and useful, and I really hope you will too. I also want to give fair warning that I may be about to drive a coach and horses through a few semi-sacred change management tenets. You should know it's not because I want to be provocative, it's because this is what experience has shown me to date. So if you do feel I've done the professional equivalent of calling your baby ugly, it's because I genuinely think we should all take a good, hard, sceptical look and apply some critical thinking to our industry from time to time. So our approach is based on the obvious tactic of asking questions, or more precisely the right questions at the right time in the right order. People ask questions in many ways, some to expose the individual being questioned, some to demonstrate how smart the questioner is, and some to show support and offer up rehearsed responses. The ones I'm talking about today are not those. Our questions are an actual, genuine inquiry for information or enlightenment. They're intended to make it easy to talk about the organisation, and as such, the ones I've pitched here shouldn't feel too aggressive or intrusive. So where do we start? How well are you positioned to deliver change successfully? It's a critical question. If you are leading a change program, it's one you need an honest and frank answer to. Everything we cover today is dedicated to answering that question. So in most cases, when I ask this question, the initial answer is, well, pretty well. However, the honest answer is probably closer to, I don't know. And now most of us will be familiar with the much quoted statistic that 70% of change programs fail, although it is hard to find the original source for that. Recent research by Prosi suggests that of the 30% who are successful, 90% have demonstrably excellent change management. Correlation rather than proof? Perhaps. David Ulrich, regarded by many as the leading thinker around HR, recently stated, being good at delivering change may be the single greatest benefit an HR team can offer their organisation. So, it helps to follow up this big question with a couple of smaller ones to get the ball rolling. Is this change part of the journey itself, or the destination? It's a classic context question. We want to know if this is a one-off or one of a number of change projects. Is this an organisation already in a state of transformation, or is this the first tentative step into a different future? Should you be focused on bringing order to chaos or disruption to order? Now, there's much talk about the value of disruption. However, it's not often that a change manager is intended to so disrupt an organisation that it ceases to function and stops delivering service or revenue. And why does any of this matter? Surely, as the football pundits say, you just play the next team in front of you, or in project manager speak, just clarify the deliverable and focus on that. Well, it matters because the context that the change sits in will probably be the single most influential factor in deciding how to approach and manage change. Maybe you're listening to this and thinking, yes, but with the right methodology, you can develop a perfect strategy to cope with the context. Well, I would point out that the evidence suggests that culture eats strategy for breakfast. So if context in general and culture in particular are the elephants in the room, then it begins to make sense that failing to answer these most basic of questions that pin down the high-level context of the change become a critical point of failure for many programs, and that's particularly true of methodology-led approaches, as we'll see a bit later on. So, having clarified the big question and potentially captured something of the context, what's the next port of call? Well, I think it's question one. What are you looking to achieve? Phrasing of this could vary, and depending upon the relationship between the parties, might even be the more brutal, why are we doing this? You can almost always guarantee a level of waffle or a response approaching the size of a minor Russian novel when you first ask this question. After that, it's usually safe to move in with a few more digestibly specific questions. Can you easily and clearly articulate the desired outcomes? Can anyone else articulate the desired outcomes? Does what and how you deliver directly link to a business objective? So the most common response I get is something along the lines of, to deliver systems / process / thing X into the company by Y date for Z cost, which is a perfect description of what you are doing, but not what you intend to achieve by doing it. So let me share a couple of real-life client examples. One client was in the global private banking industry with an unmatched multi-billion-dollar client portfolio and a history longer than most countries. They were introducing a new cloud-based enterprise software access approach. Another was a small charitable Asian women's movement in the Midlands who needed to attract funding. And to get it, they had to deal with difficult philosophical concepts of purpose and service within their mixed cultural and linguistic diversity. I asked both of these clients what they were looking to achieve. One had a concise, accurate answer and unity of purpose. The other was filled with competing versions of what it was all for. Now, you could argue that the Asian women's movement were dealing with a much, much more difficult definition than the bank. Yet they had absolutely nailed it. They were able to rally their disparate organisation and move forward rapidly and without distraction to get that funding. The bank became mired in disagreement, outcome conflict, which led to delay, poor engagement, and of course a waterfall of blame. So why are we asking about these things? Well, if you ask yourself or your organisation these questions, you need to consider how many versions of the truth you have. CIO, CEO, CFO, shareholder, HR, the general workforce. You also need to know, is one of these dominant, and could that change? Let's assume it's a major digital transformation and that it's the CIO's version of truth that's dominant. We need to know if that version is actually relevant. Many times I've personally witnessed that the changes proposed have no direct link to a stated organisational objective. The CIO believes this is a good way to spend her budget and future-proof her hardware base. But the CEO may struggle to find that on the key performance measures for this year, and everyone else struggles to see what is so important that their business has to be so disrupted. If there's no link to the organisational objectives, how can anyone credibly answer the basic question, why are we doing this? So let's assume that our CIO is able to directly link her spend to a clear organisational objective. So now we are able to articulate what we're looking to achieve and how it links to the organisation's objectives. The next hurdle is often even more challenging, pitch. I have seen communication teams in HR and in change projects craft pages of corporate speak, empty words, carefully caveated statements, all working to undermine the clarity. Mission statements or objectives that sound like they mean something but actually don't will eventually damage the credibility of the source. Now, this isn't about marketing, it's about clarity. It's not about misdirection or covering backsides or positive spin, or for that matter, undercommitting and over-delivering. Organisations can and do choose to do all of those things, However, this is one of the key places where I would argue strongly they absolutely shouldn't. Over-complexity confuses and eventually disengages people. Over-simplicity talks down to them and suggests that you're hiding something. The answer you really need is efficiency, concise, to the point, and if you're an advisor or if you're an HR leader in an organisation and you can provide this, you will be of huge benefit to that organisation. It doesn't, however, always work out that way. So, some of you may remember that there was a previous Donald in the White House. I'm going to have a crack at this one, so bear with me. There are known knowns. These are things we know that we know. There are known unknowns. That is to say, there are things that we know we don't know. But there are also unknown unknowns. These are things we don't know we don't know. Now, what Donald Rumsfeld said was exactly correct, but it feels so complicated, and he took a lot of personal criticism for it. I think Donald was trying to suggest it's probably impossible to have all the answers to absolutely every eventuality, and even though what he said was correct, it absolutely wasn't concise. If you can produce clarity around the why we are doing this question, if that answer is concise in form and clearly linked to intended outcomes and business objectives, then you will have significantly moved your program forward in a positive way. So many organisations fail utterly to do this that you would be forgiven for thinking that it can't be done. But it can. These are three that I found at random. My personal favourite is the BBC one, so I'll read that one for you. To enrich people's lives with programmes and services that inform, educate and entertain. I think that's the epitome of concise. If you spot another one out there and you love it, do pass it on to me, because I actually find it strangely reassuring when we do spot a good one. So that brings us to question 2. What sort of impact do you expect this to have on your organisation? Now, I asked this exact question in exactly this way to the CIO of a major Middle Eastern international telecoms organisation. Now, they were starting to roll out a new cloud-based document management system across thousands of their workers in multiple locations. He answered, minimal. Now, we both knew that these workers were going to lose the ability to store data locally, and that many of them travelled in regions where mobile services and access to the cloud was poor or non-existent. Yet he looked me directly in the eye and said minimal. Now, clearly minimal wasn't the case, so he was either saying, I don't want to talk to you about this, using it as a conversation stopper, or he was saying, I don't care about the impact. Both of those responses are indications of denial. All changes have impacts, and it's a matter of degree and perspective. If there's no impact, what's changed? Now, some of you will have experienced this reluctance to talk about impact. Perhaps it's because the fashion in business case authoring has turned them into documents of risk mitigation rather than opportunity development. Perhaps this focus of negative and unintended impacts has come to dominate so much that the subject of impact is almost taboo for leaders. But to reiterate, if you are changing something, there needs to be an impact or nothing has changed. Clearly, depending upon which groups we are talking to, the impacts could be positive or negative. For some HR teams dealing with closures or transfers or headcount reductions, it's quite possible that the vast majority of the impacts on certain groups will be negative. Denial won't work as a tactic for managing this. Often, change leaders and HR teams fall back on focusing on the negative, turning the driver to manage change into an insurance policy to try and avoid disaster. Leaders and sponsors may well have already decided this is a price they are willing to pay, which means it often doesn't work as a tactic. So what can we do if we're faced by this apparently insurmountable problem? The answer, I've found, is to switch tactics, break some golden rules, and ask some relatively closed questions. Will the proposed changes impact equally upon everyone? Will we need to decommission existing processes or tools? How will we know if the changes we deliver will lead to the intended outcome? In my situation, it enabled us to talk about the impacts through a completely different lens. Instead of focusing in to talk about the things that to him were big problems with no easy fix. We talked about the smaller stuff which we could manage. Impacts via the back door? Maybe. There is a critical piece of actual work that does need to be done, however, and that is understanding who is impacted, how and when. If you don't do this, you really are at best guessing, and at worst, wasting time and money. Whistling in the dark was a term used by an old colleague of mine, Gordon Player, who was describing what some people do when they are alone in a scary dark space. It makes them feel better, but would have no effect on any threat that might exist. And if the change program is based on guessing, then that's some pretty loud whistling you're doing indeed. Sadly, dealing with denial is not the only issue around managing impact. What happens if somebody digs up your runway without telling you? Context is everything. Sometimes impact awareness is a matter of perspective. And at 0 feet and 0 miles an hour, the apparent impact risk is clear and avoidable. Now at 30,000 feet and 560 miles an hour, not so much. And impacts have a habit of sneaking up on teams by hiding in plain sight, no pun intended. We often find that program teams are not blind to the impacts initially, but proximity to the project means that they become obvious and eventually not worthy of tracking. On more than a few occasions, by asking follow-on questions, I've exposed a specific significant impact upon a group which isn't being planned for. A frequent response I've received was, oh yes, that's true, but when we get to this point, that will no longer be an issue. Of course, that doesn't change the fact that for a period of time, a significant impact is seriously disrupting the business, which in turn could have a consequence down the line. But in the minds of the project team, the solution is identified, designed, programmed, and expected to be in place. And in their reality, that mitigates the impact. In real reality, it doesn't. The runway was only dug up for the weekend. So a great personal lesson for me on this was a few years ago working on a consulting assignment in a very large Scandinavian telecoms company. We were held slightly at arm's length by the resident Scandinavian HR consultancy, and we were contracted to work through them. The client was deploying a significant upgrade of their hardware, rolling out thin clients to all employees. Following our best practice approach, we spent a great deal of effort seeking to identify all the stakeholder groups, understanding the impacts and finding ways to mitigate and manage the situations. What we didn't twig was that there was an official reality and an unofficial and undocumented reality, an unknown unknown. One in which equipment was borrowed with the full knowledge and support of senior leadership and used for social purposes. Now we picked up the poor engagement but couldn't track down what was driving it. The client knew it was there and the Scandinavian HR consultancy knew it was there, but they both chose to believe that a technical fix was being worked on that meant it wouldn't be a problem in the long run. The deeply held need for consensus culturally meant that drawing out this as a problem would have been very disruptive. So they chose to believe the fix was coming and it was someone else's responsibility. So it's not just leaders who can be tempted into denial. Regardless of how awkward or uncomfortable, negative impacts need mitigating, positive impacts need promoting, and you can't do either unless you understand who's being impacted, how, and when. So how engaged do you feel the organisation is with this programme? Question 3. Well, engagement is a vast topic, but I want to cover a handful of things to remember when seeking to understand how ready you and your organisation are to successfully deliver change. A little like the impact question, there's often a base assumption about engagement being good. There's often no real evidence for this. It's a feeling or an opinion, but success or failure of the entire project could well rest on this. Big engagement events, sometimes heavily funded at the start of the program, are viewed by some leaders as having banked credits with the organisation, filled up the tank of engagement which will keep things running along nicely until the next event. Although rare, it's not impossible to find examples of organisations that have become so engaged in an event or a moment that the wider business suffers through neglect, entire budgets spent on launch events which nobody attends, or feedback channels which remain unused. This is frequently spun as, well, they must be engaged and happy, or they would be here, or they would use it. Critically, the checks and balances around this are actually relatively straightforward. How do you measure engagement in your organisation? Do you have clarity around the behaviours you want to see as evidence of engagement? What's your approach to strengthen engagement across the organisation? If you don't know what good looks like and have no plans to promote and generate it, you probably have an organisational maturity issue. So, brace yourselves, it's ugly baby time. The change curve. I don't think it's true, I don't think it's helpful, and I don't think it belongs in organisational change. Now, I used to run the KPMG internal change management course. The change curve would feature quite heavily, which, to be honest, is a bit embarrassing given how I feel about it now. And I'd be happy to defend my position, and we can discuss the validity of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross et al., but I would suggest that the industry has become fixated upon the individual. If all we focus on is trying to push or guide individuals through the change curve to acceptance, we ignore the fact that organisations at their core are a collection of groups of people. Now, I'm not saying that key individual influencers or corporate touchstones, as they would be called in the States, aren't important. Of course they are. And you must get them folded into your engagement approach. But you're doing it because they influence groups. Groups seek consensus. They ignore criticism or alternative viewpoints, up to and including isolating themselves from influences that are outside the group. There's hardly a project I've worked on where I haven't seen this to be self-evident. This groupthink, as the academics like William White or Irvin Janis talk about, is a psychological phenomenon. Groups which their desire for harmony and conformity overwhelms the interests of the individual. Now, we've witnessed the fallout from the recent media manipulation debates. Groups communicate and operate in social media echo chambers where curated information reinforces specific viewpoints and values, creating increased polarization in our society. If you or your organisation are wedded to an approach that just focuses on individual engagement, how are you going to manage groups which don't behave in what you believe are their own individual interests? Now, it's been said before, individuals are smart, but groups are dumb. So what might great engagement look like? This is the Russian space agency, Roscosmos. They're celebrating their successful launch and docking with the ISS. We can see the suits, we can see the grey hair, and most of all, we can see the Formica. The indication of an organisation that has been around since the 1950s? Yes. Sober, moderate, modest? Probably. Is this an indication of low engagement? Compare it to this. SpaceX people. Yes, that's the collective term for those that work at SpaceX. They're gathered outside the thoroughly modern glass bubble of mission control to watch the successful launch and landing of a Falcon 9. And you'd wait a very long time to see a flash of Formica here. With an average age of 30, they're a young company in the full engagement display. Groupthink in action? Possibly. Clearly, visible displays of engagement are helpful cues. However, as with strategy, culture eats engagement plans with breakfast. Cultural mores and embedded behaviours mean that we can't take everything at face value and shouldn't jump to conclusions based upon external displays of event-based engagement alone. Getting underneath engagement isn't easy, but it is another critical factor between success and failure of any change program. So, next question. How have these programs worked out in the past? Collective memory is a complicated thing, impacted by perspective and time. Truth is at best malleable and transitory. Even facts can be ignored or adapted if they contradict the perception of what happened. Change events in the past may have been excellently managed, mitigating the impacts upon the vast majority of people and improving the performance of the organisation. However, they could be remembered for the negative impact of one group which was visible and vocal, and that would colour the whole change experience as far as the collective memory of the organisation is concerned. Change is not a balance sheet. People are rarely 73.5% convinced about something. Usually they are, or they're not, or they don't know. The success or failure of a change program within an organisation will be a matter of memory. If this memory needs to be challenged, then understanding what is remembered and why is the best way to reset the scales. Tough decisions may need to be made, including walking away from talking about past experiences, even if they were successful, if the effort of changing the organisation's perception is simply too great or unlikely to be achievable. So what happens when an organisation gets too wrapped up in its own storytelling to the point of damaging its credibility with the audience? Now, not everyone will remember both of these individuals, but they provide an excellent model which is often repeated in organisation-wide change programs. On the left, George W. Bush, the former US president, stood on the deck of an aircraft carrier and claimed victory in the 2003 Iraq War. He was focused on his legacy and needed to project a positive outcome with a clear endpoint. Now, many program leaders and sponsors are guilty of declaring victory and walking away, regardless of what the real outcomes were. They do it because the program has become mired and won't now deliver what they promised, or their attention has moved on to something new, because they simply don't want to talk about it anymore. Denial. Meanwhile, the organisation has to live with the reality and limp towards some form of resolution. Now, on the right is Mohammed Saeed al-Sahaf, or Comical Ali, a nickname given to him by the European press. The American press called him Baghdad Bob. Now, he was operating very much in the now, seeking to stiffen the resolve of the Iraqi armed forces and civilians to fight the coalition. Famously, he used to present newscasts from the roof of government buildings in Baghdad to show the government wasn't hiding in deep bunkers far away, which, apart from poor Mohammed, it was. This appetite for relentless positivism in the face of clear evidence to the contrary seems to be hardwired into change programs. It is, I'm afraid, evident in the makeup of much communication around change by HR and change teams themselves. You may even have heard communication experts talking about their role being to communicate, communicate, communicate until you're sick. I know I certainly have. So how did it work out for the two above examples? Well, in President Bush's case, his mission-accomplished speech was followed by 11 years of violence, and the Washington Post argues 400,000 deaths, leaving the next administrations to struggle with an unwanted US military presence in the Middle East. It wasn't true, it didn't work, his credibility failed, and it didn't achieve the intended outcome of a bright, shining legacy. For Mohammed Saeed al-Sahaf, one of his final statements on the roof in front of the world press cameras, he claimed that the Americans had been thrown back from the suburbs of Baghdad with terrible losses. And at that moment, several US armored vehicles appeared in the background. Once again, it simply wasn't true, it didn't work, his credibility failed, and the intended outcome to keep his leader in power definitely failed. He cooperated fully with the coalition, was released after a few months, and now lives in the UEA when not visiting his son, who's a doctor in Dublin. He maintains that he was a communications professional doing his job, so you never know, we may all work with him again in the future. This isn't about the politics, of course, it's about the process. And allowing a chasm to open up between reality and story is, I would argue, loading up trouble for the future. If you are hoping that spin or relentless positivism or eliminating the negative will dig you out of a credibility gap, I would caution that these are all approaches which have a very high failure rate. I'd also include the shouting loudest style of communication, which won't listen and are really at best bad marketing. Similarly, tackling disagreement by drowning out may silence open debate, but it's probably going to drive dissent underground, where it gains further credibility while the official line bleeds credibility away. Even if you believe that a change event may need some enthusiasm and energy via comms, it must be apparent that credibility is a critical factor in organisations' retelling of their own experiences. Surely this is even more important if the change events are happening with increasing frequency. If you want to use storytelling, which is a recognised approach, or you want to point to past success as an indicator of future performance, it needs to be handled extremely well, or you run the risk of damaging your credibility as change leaders. If the answer you get to these questions in this space suggests a credibility gap, that's another major concern. So be curious and find out. Don't just accept the received wisdom. So question 5, where have you got to so far? I don't think the importance of groundwork can be overstated. It is your solid setup. On the upside, usually organisations understand the value of clarity of scope and business case development, even if they find it painful sometimes to achieve. On the downside, there can be a tendency to buy in support in the form of shiny new methodology, new tools, new techniques, rather than tackle some of the fundamental issues that sit behind the requirement. From our perspective, a strong focus on the intended outcomes and outputs early on tends to be a better starting point than being drawn into the detail of how. As we've highlighted several times, and as Mandy pointed out with the Australian example at the beginning, having an excellent methodology will not be enough on its own. When asking this question, I do have a mental checklist of things which I'm looking for and hoping to see, as well as a few that I'm watching out for. These questions are great indicators of preparedness and can open up a lot of discussion around readiness and maturity. Sometimes, of course, these conversations are happening after the change program has begun. The train has left the station and our job is to catch it and get a driver back in the cab. The how you catch a runaway change project is probably a topic for another day. However, even in those circumstances, I would still recommend we ask these basic questions, and then we can see exactly how much catch-up we need to do. So, the last question. How well are you positioned to deliver change successfully? There is a golden rule. Ask good questions, get great answers. The purpose of the questions are to help scope the amount of work needed to achieve success. It highlights gaps and potential problem areas, but of course it won't deliver the project for you. You will still have to select the right approach, develop and deploy the right interventions, and then build feedback into your approach to keep yourself self-aware. The brutal truth is, if you have the information you need already gathered in advance, you'll be able to do all of that. If you don't, then you do run the risk of becoming another one of the statistics of failure. So having been through these questions with your organisation, you find yourself back where we started, the big question. However, now you should be in a much better position to answer it. Why? Because now you can clearly and concisely articulate why this change is happening. You know who is being impacted, how and when, as well as knowing the negative impacts that need to be mitigated and the positives that need promoting. You know what good engagement looks like in your organisation, you know how to measure it and promote it, and hopefully you're not just using the change curve to do that. You know if you have a credibility gap caused by past changes, and you know how you're going to close it. You've done the work, you have the foundational information you need to move forward. You can ask and answer this question based on what you've discovered or created, and you no longer don't know. I hope you found this interesting and stimulating, and of course I'll be around to answer questions at the end. If you want to get in touch with me, even if it's just to convince me that there is some merit in the change curve, I'd love to hear from you. And one final thing, everyone's baby is beautiful, really. I'll hand you back to Mandy now. Thank you.
Thank you, John. That was really interesting. I think John has provided the questions to us now. He's posed some follow-up questions. He's given some great takeaways, so thank you again. I'd like to take a breath and just pause, actually. And just to be clear, these questions aren't the type of questions that we would throw into an organisation. There is a real skill in not only knowing the questions to ask, but in knowing the follow-up questions to ask during your inquiry, and then also understanding how to interpret the answers and take a different approach if necessary. If anyone has taken any offence to this presentation or some of the ideas, or if you just disagree with us, we'd love to have a cup of coffee with you. The white paper will have the background and the academic references to back up what John said for you all to have a read afterwards. In terms of us at HR Cubed, it may be helpful, and I'm only going to spend a couple of minutes on it, just understanding who we are. As I said at the top of the hour, we exist really to help HR teams to deliver brilliant HR services to their organisations. And in front of you now are our 6 key areas of focus. Diagnostics up front to ensure you know the strengths and any areas of development within your function. Good old people, process, technology, and all this wrapped in really strong, honest and robust change management. The service that John's area of the business can deliver is about helping HR teams and actually any business team to deal with change. Firstly, to build your change practice, that's our change partner offering, to develop your change practice, which is change support, and to ensure your change practices. So please do feel free to reach out to us if your organisation does need any support. That's as much as I'm going to say on HR Cubed. As I say, do get in touch with us. I am going to move to questions now, and we'll pose some questions to John. There are a few questions coming through. Firstly, we have Paul. He said, you showed a slide with a timeline with where this fits. Are you saying that the success of the project can be directly correlated to the answer to these 6 questions?
Oh, thanks, Paul. I think the short answer is yes. You're going to spend more money, burn more time, and you're much, much less likely to succeed. You're not going to fully deliver all of the intended outcomes.
Great, thank you. Next up, Michaela. What do you do if you can't get the right people or they won't answer your questions? I think a lot of us probably deal with that in our own organisation.
Well, you know, that is a classic, isn't it? You can't talk to the right sponsor, or you can't close down and meet with the people that you need to meet with. You need to think about why they don't want to talk to you. It could be because you've gone in previously with relentless negativism about their project. But it's equally possible that they're concerned that you're going to expose their lack of knowledge, and therefore they feel threatened and less cooperative. There are a couple of fixes. You can get a person internally to be your sponsor at a senior level, and then you're effectively sponsored into that conversation. Or you can look outside for support. You can bring in an impartial person who may not represent quite the same threat. There are a lot of ways of doing this, and obviously it's very context specific to your own organisation.
Thank you for that one, Michaela. James, if you don't mind posting your question. You've said you've got a question regarding sponsorship. Please do post it on the chat panel. If anybody else does have any questions at the moment, please feel free to pose them. I've got another one here from Jane. Our project has already started and we are already a fair way through. Is it too late for us to ask these questions?
I think I actually touched on this one. No, the train may have left the station. It's not too late. It partially depends, of course, on what you've deployed and how you've done it to date. There's no real way you can pull back credibility if you're too far down the line, but you can definitely work out where the holes in the track are going to be going forwards and make the rest of the ride a bit smoother. So no, it's not too late. You can go back and validate the project.
Great, thanks John. Okay, so we've got James who said, to be specific, active and vocal senior sponsorship is vital to the success of change. But what if the organisation cannot provide an appropriate sponsor? Good question, James. Thank you.
It is a great question. But then, in a sense, it's opportunity rather than threat. One of the things that we talk about a lot within HR Cubed is how do we get HRDs or heads of HR a seat at the top table? And it's fundamental relevance. If you are relevant to the business and you are relevant to what the business is seeking to achieve, you will at least have the opportunity to have a conversation with someone. How you get that conversation tactically, you need to get your agenda item onto somebody else's meeting, and then you need to be the go-to person to talk about it. But that effectively is the future of HR in a nutshell.
Thank you, John. That's great. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for today. If you do have any other questions, please continue to post them and we will get in contact to answer them individually. Thank you again to John Hunter, who has presented for us today. And yeah, if you do need anything, do need to get in touch, please feel free to do so. Thank you.